It is March, it is Women's History Month, and I am here today to give you book recommendations to read about amazing women throughout history. I have this broken into 3 categories. I have nonfiction, I have historical fiction, and I have fantasy. Fantasy might seem a little bit weird to include on this list, but it will make sense when we get there. Also, fantasy is one of my favorite genres to read, so I had to include some fantasy books whenever I was making this list. I will have all of these books listed in the description. If there's any that you see that you want to read and you need the title or anything like that, they will be listed in the description. Starting with the nonfiction, with Almost Astronauts. This is a story about 13 women in the 1950s in the US who were trying to become astronauts. They went through all of the tests and everything they needed to become astronauts, but they were never able to make it into space. However, they did lead the way and pave the path for the women who came behind them. This was an amazing story to read. It is one that I read years ago and still think about to this day. There's also a Netflix documentary on the people discussed in this book. It is called Mercury 13. I've not watched it yet, but it is Women's History Month, so it's a good reason to watch it. I will probably be watching it soon. The next book is Farewell to Manzanar. This is a book about a young girl who was with her family whenever the United States put all the Japanese Americans in these Japanese internment camps during World War II. This was the first time I heard about this. I read this as a young teenager, and this book has stayed with me. There are some scenes in this book that are just seared into my brain. I definitely recommend books like this to find out more about what life was like for these people. Speaking of the Japanese internment camps, I also read Silver Like Dust, which is on the same topic. This is a little bit different though. This is more of an intergenerational story. This is a girl growing up and her family never really talked about their experience, and she's learning about it a little bit at a time, and it's really her digging into her family's history, and then she also interviews her grandmother about her time in the internment camps. We see the story interwoven both modern day and the grandmother's experience in the camps in the 1940s. The next book I have on this list is maybe one you've heard about before. It is I Am Malala. This is a Pakistani girl who's going through changing climates in Pakistan. She is really determined to have an education. This is very important to her, and because of that, she's literally shot by the Taliban. And this is her story. She survived, and she is telling her story and continuing to stand up for women's education. The next book is A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. This is an incredible story about a Syrian refugee. It starts with her time in Syria and then also her escape from Syria, and she is on a boat with refugees, and their boat is intentionally sunk, and she's floating in the ocean, and she's still holding on to this hope that there's something better out there. Just the holding on to that hope, like that there's something better than your own home. Absolutely incredible, very powerful story. I definitely recommend this one. And my final nonfiction book is IraqiGirl. This is a 15-year-old girl living in war-torn Iraq, and she is writing a blog/diary, and that blog/diary has been turned into a book. And it's really just her experience as a teenager, focusing on typical teenager things, you know, school and family and friends and all of that, as well as when the electricity is going to be on, or if they'll have internet again, and if she'll be able to do her homework. There's literally war going on nearby, and I really like seeing these very personal stories of these events and just seeing how it really affects people's day-to-day lives, and I love this book for that. Next, we will go into historical fiction. I am starting off with Isla to Island. This is the only graphic novel that I have on this list. I'm not a very big graphic novel person, but this one really worked for me. This is about a Cuban immigrant. She is in Cuba during a revolution that's happening there, and her parents literally send her to family that's living in the United States because they think that she will be a lot safer in the United States. She's showing up in the United States, living with family she barely knows, living in a culture and a language that is foreign to her, and just really trying to find out what home means and what family means in these circumstances. This is also a very hopeful book. I actually found it very heartwarming, especially given the topic, and I definitely recommend this book. The next book is Between Shades of Grey. This has also been rebranded to Ashes in the Snow, I think is what it's being published under right now. The author was researching her own family's history, and she was finding out that the Soviets deported Lithuanians during World War II and sent them to work camps in Siberia. And she decided to write a story about this. And this author, Ruta Sepetys, continues to write stories about historical events that are usually not talked about or not well known. I have read 2 of her books. I really enjoyed both of them, though this was my favorite of the 2. And I really need to read the rest of her books because they all feature these strong characters who are dealing with times that are usually not even talked about, events that I did not even know about. And I definitely recommend this if you are looking for strong female characters and learning more about history that you might not know about previously. The next book is I Can Make This Promise. This is a little bit of a different recommendation on this list, but I think it is an important story. So this is a contemporary middle grade story. And I do think that you kind of have to be into contemporary middle grade to really enjoy this story, though you can get a lot out of it even if that's not your thing. So the first half of this book is a contemporary girl growing up, struggling with school life and friendship struggles and that kind of thing. But she also finds a box in the attic that alludes to things that are going on in her mother's life that her mom has not talked about with her. So the last part of the book, we find out more about the mom's story. So the mom was taken away from her indigenous family and given to a white family to be raised. And this was actually something that was very common, that these indigenous children were taken away, separated from their language and culture, and grew up really not knowing that much about their heritage. And that's what happened to the mom in this story. So it chronicles those events, and it talks about that we literally had laws passed. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed to prevent this very prevalent problem from continuing to happen. So that's kind of what this story is about. I guess you could say it's an intergenerational story. Our protagonist in this story is learning about her mom's history little bits at a time, finding out things, this box that she found in the attic, and then eventually talking to her mom and having more of these discussions explained to her. I think it's a very important story about very important topics in our history, and definitely something that I was not very aware of previously. I think it's an excellent story if you're interested in learning more about that topic. The next book is Sky in the Deep. This is a historical Viking story. It is about a girl warrior who she lost her brother in a battle in the previous fighting season, and this season she is on the battlefield and literally sees her brother fighting with the enemy, and this totally sends her spiraling, and she has to face everything that she thought she believed and face her biases and all of that. I loved this story. I read it when it very first came out, and I have reread it. I just love it. I just love it. I don't know what else to say about it. If you're looking for a Viking-esque read with a strong warrior female, this is definitely one to check out. And the last book for historical fiction I have is The Magnolia Sword. This is a Mulan retelling, but it feels much more historical. It is set in 5th century China and is really trying to be authentic and historic to that time and what a Mulan story would be like in 5th century China. I really enjoyed this one, and if you want a more historic take than maybe Disney's Mulan, definitely check this one out. And now for the fantasy. The first book on this list for fantasy is A Natural History of Dragons, which to me just screams Women's History Month list. I know it's fantasy, but let me explain. This is a historical fantasy, so it is set in our world, but with dragons. So our protagonist is living in Victorian era England, and she wants to be a dragon scientist. But dragon scientist isn't really something women of this era did. So she is fighting every step of the way to be as close to becoming a dragon scientist as she possibly can. I absolutely love this story. I was like giddy happy reading it, and I definitely recommend if Jane Austen plus fantasy dragons sounds at all appealing to you. The next book on the fantasy list is Walk on Earth, a Stranger. This is one of the most unique fantasy books that I have read. This almost didn't feel fantasy. It felt kind of Western. So this is set in the United States during the Gold Rush, and our protagonist can sense gold, like the gold sings to her, which is obviously a very nice thing to have during a gold rush. But she wants to keep this a secret because it's also kind of a dangerous gift to have during this time. A lot of people would want to use her and use her power for their own gain. She actually doesn't go out and like pans gold and becomes super rich. She is met with tragedy at the very beginning of this book, and then she ends up traveling with a found family and kind of setting up a boom town, which is these settlements that were set up during the gold rush where people were panning, and what they did was provide services, and some of the people providing the services actually ended up doing much better than those actually panning for gold. So if you're looking for a gold rush story, a fantasy western, check this one out. Also, the audiobook of Walk on Earth a Stranger might be better than reading the book. I know I fell in love with the audiobook and I really felt like it elevated the story for me. If you like audiobooks, maybe check that one out. The last book on my fantasy list is The Poppy War. This is a fantasy book, but it is set and inspired very much by historical events that happened in China. It is based on the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese Wars, which I only heard about briefly but barely knew anything about before reading this book. I was totally enthralled with this story. I have an entire vlog talking about my experience reading this story. It is about a girl who's growing up the adopted daughter of these opium smugglers, and she is determined to make a better life for herself. So she is determined to get into the top military academy, which she ends up doing, and then she ends up becoming a military person and experiencing some of the terrible wars that are going on, terrible battles that are going on around her. This story is so complex because I don't even know how to begin describing everything that happens in it, but if this sounds at all interesting to you, definitely check it out. Check out my other vlog if you want to know more. And now for 2 bonus books. I have 2 books that I have not read yet, but just seem perfect for this list. The first one is The Bronze Drum. This book just screams to me Women's History Month. It is on my list to read this month. I will be updating you if it is good. It sounds amazing though. Here's a little bit of the synopsis. A stunning novel of ancient Vietnam based on the true story of 2 warrior sisters who raised an army of women to overthrow the Han Chinese and rule as kings over a united people. Oh my gosh, that's literally all I need to know about the story. I already know I'm going to be reading this story and then be finding out about the real history that actually happened that inspired this story. It just sounds so amazing. And my last bonus book is Polar Exposure. I found this at the library. This is literally, I was just browsing the library shelves and this book stood out to me. This is about an all-women's multicultural expedition to the North Pole. That's all I know about it, and it sounds amazing and I want to read it, and I want to read about these women doing crazy adventurous things. That is all the books on this list. I hope to be doing a follow-up video that is maybe more fantasy focused, since fantasy is the primary genre that I read. Either my favorite female characters in fantasy or my favorite female authors who write fantasy. If that sounds like something you'd like, let me know in the comments so that way I know if I should do those videos. And let me know if you have read any of these books or if you have recommendations that you think people should read for Women's History Month. I hope to see you in another video, and happy reading!